Welcome to the world of active books, in the fantastic world of H.G. Wells. Born September 21st, 1866, to domestic servants turned shopkeepers, George Herbert Wells went to study at the Imperial College of Science, under the tutelage of T.H. Huxley, the world-famous Darwinist, biologist, and reformer of the 19th century English educational system. The impression was deep and can be seen in many of Wells's novels and short stories. Scrawny and tubercular, a close brush with death in young manhood led him to quit his uninspiring teaching post to become a determined author. The Time Machine, his first science fiction novel, was a huge success in 1895, and subsequent books, such as The Invisible Man and The War of the Worlds, cemented his place as a father of the modern science fiction genre and a literary master of his generation. Some of H.G.'s most striking science fiction ideas, however, appear in his short stories. The 4 short stories selected for this volume were chosen to represent some of his strongest tales, bridging the 4 cornerstones of contemporary science fiction. In one of his finest stories, The Star, published in 1897, Wells pursues the issue of human vulnerability to an apocalyptic conclusion. The new Accelerator, published in 1901, is a prose cartoon about an unscrupulous professor who plans to manufacture a super drug despite the likelihood that it will be abused. Wells' perspective on the contingency of human civilization are not always extraterrestrial or scientific per se. The Empire of the Ants, published in 1905, promotes a vision of the recolonization of Earth by a remarkably clever and swiftly breeding strain of ants. Variations on the visionary motif occur in The Crystal Egg, published in 1897, a grotesque fantasy about a mysterious object that permits one world to watch another. H.G. Wells died in 1946 at the age of 80, shortly after the detonation of the first atomic bomb, an event he foretold in a short story written in 1914. The science fiction field has yet to produce a greater figure. Please join us now as we look in on an unhappy antique dealer with others not of this world.
The Star. It was on the first day of the new year that the announcement was made, almost simultaneously from 3 observatories, that the motion of the planet Neptune, the outermost of all the planets that wheel about the sun, had become very erratic. Ogilvy had already called attention to a suspected retardation in its velocity in December. Such a piece of news was scarcely calculated to interest a world the greater portion of whose inhabitants were unaware of the existence of the planet Neptune, nor outside the astronomical profession did the subsequent discovery of a faint remote speck of light in the region of the perturbed planet cause any very great excitement. Scientific people, however, found the intelligence remarkable enough, even before it became known that the new body was rapidly growing larger and brighter, that its motion was quite different from the orderly progress of the planets, and that the deflection of Neptune and its satellite was becoming now of an unprecedented kind. Few people without a training in science can realize the huge isolation of the solar system. The sun, with its specks of planets, its dust of planetoids, and its impalpable comets, swims in a vacant immensity that almost defeats the imagination. Beyond the orbit of Neptune there is space, vacant so far as human observation has penetrated, without warmth or light or sound, blank emptiness for 20 million times a million miles. That is the smallest estimate of the distance to be traversed before the very nearest of the stars is attained. And, saving a few comets more unsubstantial than the thinnest flame, no matter had ever to human knowledge crossed this gulf of space, until early in the 20th century this strange wanderer appeared. A vast mass of matter it was, bulky, heavy, rushing without warning out of the black mystery of the sky into the radiance of the sun. By the second day it was clearly visible to any decent instrument as a speck with a barely sensible diameter in the constellation Leo near Regulus. In a little while an opera glass could attain it. On the third day of the new year, the newspaper readers of two hemispheres were made aware for the first time of the real importance of this unusual apparition in the heavens. A planetary collision, one London paper headed the news, and proclaimed Duchesne's opinion that this strange new planet would probably collide with Neptune. The leader writers enlarged upon the topic, so that in most of the capitals of the world on January 3rd there was an expectation, however vague, of some imminent phenomenon in the sky, and as the night followed the sunset round the globe, thousands of men turned their eyes skyward to see the old familiar stars just as they had always been. Until it was dawn in London, and Pollux setting, and the stars overhead grown pale. The winter's dawn it was, a sickly filtering accumulation of daylight, and the light of gas and candles shone yellow in the windows to show where people were astir. But the yawning policeman saw the thing. The busy crowds in the markets stopped agape. Workmen going to their work betimes, milkmen, the drivers of news carts, dissipation going home jaded and pale, homeless wanderers, sentinels on their beats and in the country, laborers trudging afield, poachers slinking home, all over the dusky, quickening country it could be seen, and out at sea by seamen watching for the day, a great white star comes suddenly into the westward sky. Brighter it was than any star in our skies, brighter than the evening star at its brightest. It still glowed out white and large, no mere twinkling spot of light, but a small, round, clear, shining disk, an hour after the day had come. And where science has not reached, men stared and feared, telling one another of the wars and pestilences that are foreshadowed by these fiery signs in the heavens. Sturdy Boers, dusky Hottentots, Gold Coast Negroes, Frenchmen, Spaniards, Portuguese, stood in the warmth of the sunrise watching the setting of this strange new star. And in 100 observatories there had been suppressed excitement, rising almost to shouting pitch as the two remote bodies had rushed together, and hurrying to and fro to gather photographic apparatus and spectroscope, and this appliance and that, to record this novel, astonishing sight, the destruction of a world. For it was a world, a sister planet of our Earth, far greater than our Earth indeed, that had so suddenly flashed into flaming death. Neptune, it was, had been struck fairly and squarely by the strange planet from outer space, and the heat of the concussion had incontinently turned two solid globes into one vast mass of incandescence. Round the world that day, 2 hours before the dawn, went the pallid great white star, fading only as it sank westward and the sun mounted above it. Everywhere men marveled at it, but of all those who saw it none could have marveled more than those sailors, habitual watchers of the stars, who far away at sea had heard nothing of its advent, and saw it now rise like a pygmy moon and climb zenithward and hang overhead and sink westward with the passing of the night. And when next it rose over Europe, everywhere were crowds of watchers on hilly slopes, on house roofs, in open spaces, staring eastward for the rising of the great new star. It rose with a white glow in front of it, like the glare of a white fire, and those who had seen it come into existence the night before cried out at the sight of it. "It is larger," they cried. "It is brighter." And indeed, the moon, a quarter full, and sinking in the west, was in its apparent size beyond comparison, but scarcely in all its breadth had it as much brightness now as the little circle of the strange new star. "It is brighter," cried the people clustering in the streets. But in the dim observatories the watchers held their breath and peered at one another. "It is nearer," they said. "Nearer!" And voice after voice repeated, "It is nearer," and the clicking telegraph took that up, and it trembled along the telephone wires, and in 1,000 cities grimy compositors fingered the type. It is nearer. Men writing in offices, struck with the strange realization, flung down their pens. Men talking in 1,000 places suddenly came upon a grotesque possibility in those words. It is nearer. It hurried along awakening streets. It was shouted down the frost-stilled ways of quiet villages. Men who had read these things from the throbbing tape stood in yellow-lit doorways shouting the news to the passers-by. It is nearer. Pretty women, flushed and glittering, heard the news told jestingly between the dances, and feigned an intelligent interest they did not feel. Nearer, indeed! How curious! How very, very clever people must be to find out things like that. Lonely tramps faring through the wintry night murmured those words to comfort themselves, looking skyward. "It has need to be nearer, for the night's as cold as charity. Don't seem much warmer from it, if it is nearer all the same." "What is a new star to me?" cried the weeping woman kneeling beside her dead. The schoolboy, rising early for his examination work, puzzled it out for himself, with the great white star shining broad and bright through the frost flowers of his window. "Centrifugal, centripetal," he said, with his chin on his fist. "Stop a planet in its flight, rob it of its centrifugal force. What then? Centripetal has it, and down it falls into the sun. And this... Do we come in the way, I wonder?" The light of that day went the way of its brethren, and with the later watches of the frosty darkness rose the strange star again. And it was now so bright that the waxing moon seemed but a pale yellow ghost of itself, hanging huge in the sunset. In a South African city a great man had married, and the streets were alight to welcome his return with his bride. "Even the skies have illuminated," said the flatterer. Under Capricorn, 2 Negro lovers, daring the wild beasts and evil spirits for love of one another, crouched together in a cane-brake where the fireflies hovered. "That is our star," they whispered, and felt strangely comforted by the sweet brilliance of its light. The master mathematician sat in his private room and pushed the papers from him. His calculations were already finished. In a small white file there still remained a little of the drug that had kept him awake and active for 4 long nights. Each day, serene, explicit, patient as ever, he had given his lecture to his students, and then had come back at once to this momentous calculation. His face was grave, a little drawn and hectic from his drugged activity. For some time he seemed lost in thought. Then he went to the window, and the blind went up with a click. Halfway up the sky, over the clustering roofs, chimneys, and steeples of the city, hung the star. He looked at it as one might look into the eyes of a brave enemy. "You may kill me," he said after a silence, "but I can hold you, and all the universe for that matter, in the grip of this little brain. I would not change, even now." He looked at the little file. "There will be no need of sleep again," he said. The next day at noon, punctual to the minute, he entered his lecture theatre, put his hat on the end of the tables as his habit was, and carefully selected a large piece of chalk. It was a joke among his students that he could not lecture without that piece of chalk to fumble in his fingers, and once he had been stricken to impotence by their hiding his supply. He came and looked under his grey eyebrows at the rising tiers of young, fresh faces, and spoke with his accustomed, studied commonness of phrasing. "Circumstances have arisen, circumstances beyond my control," he said, and paused, "which will debar me from completing the course I had designed. It would seem, gentlemen, if I may put the thing clearly and briefly, that man has lived in vain." The students glanced at one another. Had they heard aright? Mad? Raised eyebrows and grinning lips there were, but one or two faces remained intent upon his calm, grey-fringed face. "It will be interesting," he was saying, "to devote this morning to an exposition, so far as I can make it clear to you, of the calculations that have led me to this conclusion. Let us assume—" He turned towards the blackboard, meditating a diagram in the way that was usual to him. "What was that about lived in vain?" whispered one student to another. "Listen," said the other, nodding towards the lecturer. And presently they began to understand. That night the star rose later, for its proper eastward motion had carried it some way across Leo towards Virgo, and its brightness was so great that the sky became a luminous blue as it rose, and every star was hidden in its turn, save only Jupiter near the zenith, Capella, Aldebaran, Sirius, and the pointers of the Bear. It was very white and beautiful. In many parts of the world that night a pallid halo encircled it about. It was perceptibly larger. In the clear, refractive sky of the tropics it seemed as if it were nearly a quarter the size of the moon. The frost was still on the ground in England, but the world was as brightly lit as if it were midsummer moonlight. One could see to read quite ordinary print by that cold, clear light, and in the cities the lamps burnt yellow and wan. And everywhere the world was awake that night, and throughout Christendom a sombre murmur hung in the keen air over the countryside like the belling of bees in the heather, and this murmurous tumult grew to a clangor in the cities. It was the tolling of the bells in a million belfry towers and steeples, summoning the people to sleep no more, to sin no more, but to gather in their churches and pray. And overhead, growing larger and brighter as the earth rolled on its way and the night passed, rose the dazzling star. And the streets and houses were alight in all the city, the shipyards glared, and whatever roads led to high country were lit and crowded all night long. And in all the seas about the civilized lands, ships with throbbing engines and ships with bellying sails, crowded with men and living creatures, were standing out to ocean and the north. For already the warning of the master mathematician had been telegraphed all over the world, and translated into 100 tongues. The new planet and Neptune, locked in a fiery embrace, were whirling headlong ever faster and faster towards the sun. Already every second this blazing mass flew 100 miles, and every second its terrific velocity increased. As it flew now, indeed, it must pass 100 million miles wide of the earth and scarcely affect it. But near its destined path, as yet only slightly perturbed, spun the mighty planet Jupiter, and his moons sweeping splendidly round the sun. Every moment now the attraction between the fiery star and the greatest of the planets grew stronger. And the result of that attraction? Inevitably, Jupiter would be deflected from his orbit into an elliptical path, and the burning star, swung by his attraction wide of its sunward rush, would describe a curved path, and perhaps collide with, and certainly pass very close to, our Earth. Earthquakes, volcanic outbreaks, cyclones, sea waves, floods, and a steady rise in temperature to I know not what limit. So prophesied the master mathematician. And overhead, to carry out his words, lonely and cold and livid, blazed the star of the coming doom. To many who stared at it that night until their eyes ached, it seemed that it was visibly approaching. And that night, too, the weather changed, and the frost that had gripped all Central Europe and France and England softened towards a thaw. But you must not imagine, because I have spoken of people praying through the night, and people going aboard ships, and people fleeing towards mountainous country, that the whole world was already in a terror because of the star. As a matter of fact, use and want still ruled the world, and save for the talk of idle moments and the splendor of the night, 9 human beings out of 10 were still busy at their common occupations. In all the cities, the shops, save one here and there, opened and closed at their proper hours. The doctor and the undertaker plied their trades. The workers gathered in the factories. Soldiers drilled, scholars studied, lovers sought one another, thieves lurked and fled, politicians planned their schemes. The presses of the newspapers roared through the nights, and many a priest of this church and that would not open his holy building to further what he considered a foolish panic. The newspapers insisted on the lesson of the year 1000, for then, too, people had anticipated the end. The star was no star, mere gas, a comet, and were it a star, it could not possibly strike the earth. There was no precedent for such a thing. Common sense was sturdy everywhere, scornful, jesting, a little inclined to persecute the obdurate fearful. That night at 7:15 by Greenwich time, the star would be at its nearest to Jupiter. Then the world would see the turn things would take. The master mathematician's grim warnings were treated by many as so much mere elaborate self-advertisement. Common sense at last, a little heated by argument, signified its unalterable convictions by going to bed. So too barbarism and savagery, already tired of the novelty, went about their mighty business, and save for a howling dog here and there, the beast world left the star unheeded. And yet, when at last the watchers in the European states saw the star rise, an hour later, it is true, but no larger than it had been the night before, there was still plenty awake to laugh at the master mathematician, to take the danger as if it had passed. But hereafter the laughter ceased. The star grew. It grew with a terrible steadiness hour after hour, a little larger each hour, a little nearer the midnight zenith, and brighter until it had turned night into a second day. Had it come straight to the earth instead of in a curved path, had it lost no velocity to Jupiter, it must have leapt the intervening gulf in a day. But as it was, it took 5 days altogether to come by our planet. The next night it had become a third the size of the moon before it set to English eyes, and the thaw was assured. It rose over America near the size of the moon, but blinding white to look at, and hot, and a breath of hot wind blew now with its rising and gathering strength, and in Virginia and Brazil and down the St. Lawrence Valley it shone intermittently through a driving reek of thunderclouds, flickering violet lightning and hail unprecedented. In Manitoba was a thaw and devastating floods, and upon all the mountains of the earth the snow and ice began to melt that night, and all the rivers coming out of the high country flowed thick and turbid, and soon, in their upper reaches, with swirling trees and the bodies of beasts and men. They rose steadily in the ghostly brilliance, and came trickling over their banks at last, behind the flying population of their valleys. And along the coast of Argentina and up the South Atlantic the tides were higher than had ever been in the memory of man, and the storms drove the waters in many cases scores of miles inland, drowning whole cities. and so great grew the heat during the night that the rising of the sun was like the coming of a shadow. The earthquakes began and grew until all down America, from the Arctic Circle to Cape Horn, hillsides were sliding, fissures were opening, and houses and walls crumbling to destruction. The whole side of Cotopaxi slipped out in one vast convulsion, and a tumult of lava poured out so high and broad and swift and liquid that in one day it reached the sea. So the star, with the wan moon in its wake, marched across the Pacific, trailed the thunderstorms like the hem of a robe, and the growing tidal wave that toiled behind it, frothing and eager, poured over island and swept them clear of men. Until that wave came at last, in a blinding light and with the breath of a furnace, swift and terrible it came, a wall of water 50 feet high, roaring hungrily upon the long coasts of Asia, and swept inland across the plains of China. For a space the star, hotter now and larger and brighter than the sun in its strength, showed with pitiless brilliance the wide and populous country. Towns and villages with their pagodas and trees, roads, wide cultivated fields, millions of sleepless people staring in helpless terror at the incandescent sky. And then, low and growing, came the murmur of the flood. And thus it was with millions of men that night, a flight no whither, with limbs heavy with heat and breath fierce and scant, and the flood like a wall swift and white behind. And then death. China was lit glowing white, but over Japan and Java and all the islands of eastern Asia the great star was a ball of dull red fire because of the steam and smoke and ashes the volcanoes were spouting forth to salute its coming. Above was the lava, hot gases and ash, and below the seething floods, and the whole earth swayed and rumbled with the earthquake shocks. Soon the immemorial snows of Tibet and the Himalaya were melting and pouring down by 10 million deepening, converging channels upon the plains of Burma and Hindustan. The tangled summits of the Indian jungles were aflame in 1,000 places, and below the hurrying waters around the stems were dark objects that still struggled feebly and reflected the blood-red tongues of fire. And in a rudderless confusion a multitude of men and women fled down the broad riverways to that one last hope of men, the open sea. Larger grew the star, and larger, hotter and brighter with a terrible swiftness now. The tropical ocean had lost its phosphorescence, and the whirling stream rose in ghostly wreaths from the black waves that plunged incessantly, speckled with storm-tossed ships. And then came a wonder. It seemed to those who in Europe watched for the rising of the star that the world must have ceased its rotation. In 1,000 open spaces of down and upland the people who had fled thither from the floods and the falling houses and sliding slopes of hill watched for that rising in vain. Hour followed hour through a terrible suspense, and the star rose not. Once again men set their eyes upon the old constellations they had counted lost to them forever. In England it was hot and clear overhead, though the ground quivered perpetually, but in the tropics Sirius and Capella and Aldebaran showed through a veil of steam. And when at last the great star rose near 10 hours late, the sun rose close upon it, and in the center of its white heart was a disk of black. Over Asia it was the star had begun to fall behind the movement of the sky, and then suddenly, as it hung over India, its light had been veiled. All the plain of India, from the mouth of the Indus to the mouths of the Ganges, was a shallow waste of shining water that night, out of which rose temples and palaces, mounds and hills, black with people. Every minaret was a clustering mass of people, who fell one by one into the turbid waters, as heat and terror overcame them. The whole land seemed a wailing, and suddenly there swept a shadow across that furnace of despair, and a breath of cold wind, and a gathering of clouds out of the cooling air. Men looking up, near blinded, at the star, saw that a black disk was creeping across the light. It was the moon, coming between the star and the earth. And even as men cried to God at this respite, out of the east with a strange, inexplicable swiftness sprang the sun. And then star, sun, and moon rushed together across the heavens. So it was that presently, to the European watchers, star and sun rose close upon each other, drove headlong for a space, and then slower, and at last came to rest. Star and sun merged into one glare of flame at the zenith of the sky. The moon no longer eclipsed the star, but was lost to sight in the brilliance of the sky. And though those who were still alive regarded it for the most part with that dull stupidity that hunger, fatigue, heat, and despair engender, there were still men who could perceive the meaning of these signs. Star and earth had been at their nearest, had swung about one another, and the star had passed. Already it was receding, swifter and swifter, in the last stage of its headlong journey downward into the sun. And then the clouds gathered, blotting out the vision of the sky. The thunder and lightning wove a garment round the world. All over the earth was such a downpour of rain as men had never before seen, and where the volcanoes flared red against the cloud canopy there descended torrents of mud. Everywhere the waters were pouring off the land, leaving mud-silted ruins, and the earth littered like a storm-worn beach with all that had floated, and the dead bodies of the men and brutes, its children. For days the water streamed off the land, sweeping away soil and trees and houses in the way, and piling huge dikes and scooping out titanic gullies over the countryside. Those were the days of darkness that followed the star and the heat. All through them, and for many weeks and months, the earthquakes continued. But the star had passed, and men, hunger-driven and gathering courage only slowly, might creep back to their ruined cities, buried granaries, and sodden fields. Such few ships as had escaped the storms of that time came stunned and shattered and sounding their way cautiously through the new marks and shoals of once familiar ports. As the storms subsided, men perceived that everywhere the days were hotter than of yore, and the sun larger, and the moon, shrunk to a third of its former size, took now 80 days between its new and new. But of the new brotherhood that grew presently among men, of the saving of laws and books and machines, of the strange change that had come over Iceland and Greenland and the shores of Baffin's Bay, so that the sailors coming there presently found them green and gracious, and could scarcely believe their eyes, this story does not tell. Nor of the movement of mankind now that the earth was hotter, northward and southward towards the poles of the earth. It concerns itself only with the coming and the passing of the star. The Martian astronomers, for there are astronomers on Mars, although they are very different beings from men, were naturally profoundly interested in these things. They saw them from their own standpoint, of course. Considering the mass and temperature of the missile that was flung through our solar system into the sun, one wrote, it is astonishing what a little damage the earth, which it missed so narrowly, has sustained. All the familiar continental markings and the masses of the seas remain intact, and indeed the only difference seems to be a shrinkage of the white discoloration, supposed to be frozen water, round either pole, which only shows how small the vastest of human catastrophes may seem at a distance of a few million miles. The New Accelerator. Certainly, if ever a man found a guinea when he was looking for a pin, it is my good friend Professor Gibberne. I have heard before of investigators overshooting the mark, but never quite to the extent that he has done. He has really, this time at any rate, without any touch of exaggeration in the phrase, found something to revolutionize human life, and that when he was simply seeking an all-round nervous stimulant to bring languid people up to the stresses of these pushful days. I have tasted the stuff now several times, and I cannot do better than to describe the effect the thing had on me. That there are astonishing experiences in store for all in search of new sensations will become apparent enough. Professor Gibberne, as many people know, is my neighbor in Folkestone. Unless my memory plays a trick, his portrait at various ages has already appeared in the Strand magazine, I think late in 1899. But I am unable to look it up because I have lent that volume to someone who has never sent it back. The reader may, perhaps, recall the high forehead and the singularly long black eyebrows that give such a Mephistophelian touch to his face. He occupies one of those pleasant detached houses in the mixed style that make the western end of the upper Sandgate Road so interesting. His is the one with the Flemish gables and the Moorish portico, and it is in the room with the mullioned bay window that he works when he is down here, and in which of an evening we have so often smoked and talked together. He is a mighty jester, but besides he likes to talk to me about his work. He is one of those men who find a help and stimulus in talking, and so I have been able to follow the conception of the New Accelerator right up from a very early stage. Of course, the greater portion of his experimental work is not done in Folkestone, but in Gower Street, in the fine new laboratory next to the hospital that he has been the first to use. As everyone knows, or at least as all intelligent people know, the special department in which Gibberne has gained so great and deserved a reputation among physiologists is the action of drugs upon the nervous system. Upon soporifics, sedatives, and anesthetics, he is, I am told, unequaled. He is also a chemist of considerable eminence, and I suppose in the subtle and complex jungle of riddles that centers about the ganglion cell and the axis fiber, there are little cleared spaces of his making, glades of illumination that, until he sees fit to publish his results, are inaccessible to every other living man. And in the last few years he has been particularly assiduous upon this question of nervous stimulants, and already, before the discovery of the New Accelerator, very successful with them. Medical science has to thank him for at least 3 distinct and absolutely safe invigorators of unrivaled value to practicing men. In cases of exhaustion, the preparation known as Gibberne's bee syrup has, I suppose, saved more lives already than any lifeboat round the coast. "But none of these things begin to satisfy me yet," he told me nearly a year ago. "Either they increase the central energy without affecting the nerves, or they simply increase the available energy by lowering the nervous conductivity. And all of them are unequal and local in their operation. One wakes up the heart and viscera and leaves the brain stupefied. One gets at the brain champagne fashion and does nothing good for the solar plexus. And what I want, and what, if it's an earthly possibility, I mean to have, is a stimulant that stimulates all round, that wakes you up for a time from the crown of your head to the tip of your great toe, and makes you go 2 or even 3 to everybody else's 1. Eh? That's the thing I'm after." "It would tire a man," I said. "Not a doubt of it. And you'd eat a double or triple, and all that. But just think what the thing would mean. Imagine yourself with a little phial like this." He held up a bottle of green glass and marked his points with it. "And in this precious phial is the power to think twice as fast, move twice as quickly, do twice as much work in a given time as you could otherwise do." "But is such a thing possible?" "I believe so. If it isn't,
I've wasted my time for a year. These various preparations of the hypophosphites, for example, seem to show that something of the sort, even if it was only 1.5 times as fast, it would do."
"It would do," I said.
If you were a statesman in a corner, for example, time rushing up against you, something urgent to be done, eh?"
"He could dose his private secretary," I said.
"And gain double time. And think if you, for example, wanted to finish a book."
"Usually," I said, "I wish I'd never begun 'em."
Or a doctor, driven to death, wants to sit down and think out a case. Or a barrister, or a man cramming for an examination.
"Worth a guinea a drop," said I, "and more to men like that."
And in a duel again," said Givern, "where it all depends on your quickness in pulling the trigger."
"Or in fencing," I echoed.
"You see," said Givern, "if I get it as an all-round thing, it will really do you no harm at all, except perhaps to an infinitesimal degree it brings you nearer old age. You will just have lived twice to other people's once."
"I suppose," I meditated, "in a duel it would be fair?"
"That's a question for the seconds," said Givern.
I harked back further. "And you really think such a thing is possible?" I said.
"As possible,"
said Givern, and glanced at something that went throbbing by the window,
"as a motor bus. As a matter of fact—"
He paused and smiled at me deeply, and tapped slowly on the edge of his desk with the green file.
"I think I know the stuff. Already I've got something coming."
The nervous smile upon his face betrayed the gravity of his revelation. He rarely talked of his actual experimental work unless things were very near the end.
"And it may be, I shouldn't be surprised. It may even do the thing at a greater rate than twice."
"It would be rather a big thing," I hazarded.
"It will be, I think, rather a big thing."
But I don't think he quite knew what a big thing it was to be, for all that. I remember we had several subsequent talks about the stuff. The new Accelerator, he called it, and his tone about it grew more confident on each occasion. Sometimes he talked nervously of unexpected physiological results its use might have, and then he would get a bit unhappy. At others he was frankly mercenary, and we debated long and anxiously how the preparation might be turned to commercial account.
"It's a good thing," said Givern, "a tremendous thing. I know I'm giving the world something, and I think it only reasonable we should expect the world to pay. The dignity of science is all very well, but I think somehow I must have the monopoly of the stuff for, say, 10 years. I don't see why all the fun in life should go to the dealers in ham."
My own interest in the coming drug certainly did not wane in the time. I have always had a queer twist towards metaphysics in my mind. I have always been given to paradoxes about space and time, and it seemed to me that Givern was really preparing no less than the absolute acceleration of life. Suppose a man repeatedly dosed with such a preparation. He would live an active and record life indeed, but he would be an adult at 11, middle-aged at 25, and by 30 well on the road to senile decay. It seemed to me that so far Givern was only going to do for anyone who took his drug exactly what nature has done for the Jews and Orientals, who are men in their teens and aged by 50, and quicker in thought and act than we are all the time. The marvel of drugs has always been great to my mind. You can madden a man, calm a man, make him incredibly strong and alert, or a helpless log, quicken this passion and allay that, all by means of drugs, and here was a new miracle to be added to this strange armory of phials the doctors use. But Givern was far too eager upon his technical points to enter very keenly into my aspect of the question. It was the 7th or 8th of August when he told me the distillation that would decide his failure or success for a time was going forward as we talked, and it was on the 10th that he told me the thing was done and the new Accelerator a tangible reality in the world.
I met him as I was going up the Sandgate Hill towards Folkestone. I think I was going to get my hair cut, and he came hurrying down to meet me. I suppose he was coming to my house to tell me at once of his success. I remember that his eyes were unusually bright, his face flushed, and I noted even then the swift alacrity of his step. "It's done," he cried, and gripped my hand, speaking very fast. "It's more than done. Come up to my house and see." "Really?" "Really," he shouted. "Incredibly. Come up and see." "And it does? Twice?" "It does more, much more. It scares me. Come up and see the stuff. Taste it. Try it. It's the most amazing stuff on earth." He gripped my arm, and walking at such a pace that he forced me into a trot, went shouting with me up the hill. A whole carabanc full of people turned and stared at us in unison after the manner of people in carabancs. It was one of those hot, clear days that Folkestone sees so much of, every color incredibly bright and every outline hard. There was a breeze, of course, but not so much breeze as sufficed under these conditions to keep me cool and dry. I panted for mercy. "I'm not walking fast, am I?" cried Gibbon, and slackened his pace to a quick march. "You've been taking some of this stuff," I puffed. "No," he said. "At the utmost a drop of water that stood in a beaker from which I had washed out the last traces of the stuff. I took some last night, you know, but that's ancient history now." "And it goes twice?" I said, nearing his doorway in a grateful perspiration. "It goes 1,000 times, many 1,000 times," cried Gibbon with a dramatic gesture, flinging open his early English carved oak gate. "Phew," said I, and followed him to the door. "I don't know how many times it goes," he said, with his latch-key in his hand. "And it throws all sorts of light on nervous physiology. It kicks the theory of vision into a perfectly new shape. Heaven knows how many 1,000 times. We'll try all that after. The thing is to try the stuff now." "To try the stuff?" I said, as we went along the passage. "Rather," said Gibbon, turning on me in his study. "There it is in that little green file there, unless you happen to be afraid." I am a careful man by nature, and only theoretically adventurous. I was afraid, but on the other hand, there is pride. "Well," I haggled, "you say you've tried it?" "I've tried it," he said, "and I don't look hurt by it, do I? I don't even look livery, and I feel—" I sat down. "Give me the potion," I said. "If the worst comes to the worst, it will save having my hair cut, and that, I think, is one of the most hateful duties of a civilized man. How do you take the mixture?" "With water," said Gibbon, whacking down a carafe. He stood up in front of his desk and regarded me in his easy-chair. His manner was suddenly affected by a touch of the Harley Street specialist. "It's rum stuff, you know," he said. I made a gesture with my hand. "I must warn you in the first place, as soon as you've got it down, to shut your eyes and open them very cautiously in a minute or so's time. One still sees. Sense of vision is a question of length of vibration and not of multitude of impacts. But there is a kind of shock to the retina, a nasty giddy confusion just at the time if the eyes are open. Keep 'em shut." "Shut," I said. "Good. And the next thing is, keep still. Don't begin to whack about. You may fetch something a nasty rap if you do. Remember, you will be going several 1,000 times faster than you ever did before. Heart, lungs, muscles, brain, everything. And you will hit hard without knowing it. You won't know it, you know. You'll feel just as you do now. Only everything in the world will seem to be going ever so many 1,000 times slower than it ever went before. That's what makes it so deuced queer." "Lor," I said, "and you mean—" "You'll see," said he, and took up a measure. He glanced at the material on his desk. "Glasses," he said. "Water, all here. Mustn't take too much for the first attempt." The little phial glucked out its precious contents. "Don't forget what I told you," he said, turning the contents of the measure into a glass in the manner of an Italian waiter measuring whiskey. "Sit with the eyes tightly shut and in absolute stillness for 2 minutes," he said. Then you will hear me speak." He added an inch or so of water to the dose in each glass. "By the by," he said, "don't put your glass down. Keep it in your hand and rest your hand on your knee. Yes, so. And now." He raised his glass. "The new Accelerator," I said. "The new Accelerator," he answered, and we touched glasses and drank, and instantly I closed my eyes. You know that blank non-existence into which one drops when one has taken gas? For an indefinite interval it was like that. Then I heard Gibberne telling me to wake up, and I stirred and opened my eyes. There he stood as he had been standing, glass still in hand. It was empty. That was all the difference. "Well," said I. "Nothing out of the way?" "Nothing. A slight feeling of exhilaration, perhaps. Nothing more." "Sounds?" "Things are still," I said. "By Jove, yes. They are still. Except the sort of faint patter like rain falling on different things. What is it?" "Analyzed sounds, I think he said, but I'm not sure." He glanced at the windows. "Have you ever seen a curtain before a window fixed in that way before?" I followed his eyes, and there was the end of the curtain, frozen, as it were, corner high, in the act of flapping briskly in the breeze. "No," said I, "that's odd." "And here," he said, and opened the hand that held the glass. Naturally, I winced, expecting the glass to smash. But so far from smashing, it did not even seem to stir. It hung in mid-air, motionless. "Roughly speaking," said Gibberne, "an object in these latitudes falls 16 feet in the first second. This glass is falling 16 feet in a second now, only, you see, it hasn't been falling yet for the 100th part of a second. That gives you some idea of the pace of my accelerator?" And he waved his hand round and round, over and under the slowly sinking glass. Finally, he took it by the bottom, pulled it down, and placed it very carefully on the table. "Eh?" he said to me, and laughed. "That seems all right," I said, and began very gingerly to raise myself from my chair. I felt perfectly well, very light and comfortable, and quite confident in my mind. I was going fast all over. My heart, for example, was beating 1,000 times a second, but that caused me no discomfort at all. I looked out of the window. An immovable cyclist, head down, with a frozen puff of dust behind his driving wheel, scorched to overtake a galloping charabanc that did not stir. I gaped in amazement at this incredible spectacle. "Gibberne," I cried, "how long will this confounded stuff last?" "Heaven knows," he answered. "Last time I took it, I went to bed and slept it off. I tell you, I was frightened. It must have lasted some minutes, I think. It seemed like hours. But after a bit it slows down rather suddenly, I believe." I was proud to observe that I did not feel frightened. I suppose because there were two of us. "Why shouldn't we go out?" I asked. "Why not?" "They'll see us." "Not they. Goodness, no. Why, we shall be going 1,000 times faster than the quickest conjuring trick that is ever done. Come along. Which way shall we go, window or door?" And out by the window we went. Assuredly, of all the strange experiences that I have ever had, or imagined, or read of other people having or imagining, that little raid I made with Gibberne on the Folkestone Leas, under the influence of the new Accelerator, was the strangest and maddest of all. We went out by his gate into the road, and there we made a minute examination of the statuesque passing traffic. The tops of the wheels and some of the legs of the horses of this carabanc, the end of the whiplash and the lower jaw of the conductor, who was just beginning to yawn, were perceptibly in motion, but all the rest of the lumbering conveyance seemed still, and quite noiseless except for a faint rattling that came from one man's throat. And as parts of this frozen edifice there were a driver, you know, and a conductor, and 11 people. The effect as we walked about the thing began by being madly queer and ended by being disagreeable. There they were, people like ourselves and yet not like ourselves, frozen in careless attitudes, caught in mid-gesture. A girl and a man smiled at one another, a leering smile that threatened to last for evermore. A woman in a floppy capelline rested her arm on the rail and stared at Gibbon's house with the unwinking stare of eternity. A man stroked his mustache like a figure of wax, and another stretched a tiresome stiff hand with extended fingers towards his loosened hat. We stared at them. We laughed at them. We made faces at them. And then a sort of disgust of them came upon us, and we turned away and walked round in front of the cyclist towards the Leas. "Goodness!" cried Gibbon suddenly. "Look there!" He pointed, and there at the tip of his finger, and sliding down the air with wings flapping slowly and at the speed of an exceptionally languid snail, was a bee. And so we came out upon the Leas. There the thing seemed madder than ever. The band was playing in the upper stand, though all the sound it made for us was a low-pitched, wheezy rattle, a sort of prolonged last sigh that passed at times into a sound like the slow, muffled ticking of some monstrous clock. Frozen people stood erect. Strange, silent, self-conscious-looking dummies hung unstably in mid-stride, promenading upon the grass. I passed close to a poodle dog suspended in the act of leaping, and watched the slow movement of his legs as he sank to earth. "Lord, look here!" cried Gibbon, and we halted for a moment before a magnificent person in white fate-striped flannels, white shoes, and a Panama hat, who turned back to wink at two gaily dressed ladies he had passed. A wink, studied with such leisurely deliberation as we could afford, is an unattractive thing. It loses any quality of alert gaiety, and one remarks that the winking eye does not completely close, that under its drooping lid appears the lower edge of an eyeball and a line of white. "Heaven give me memory," said I, "and I will never wink again." "Or smile," said Gibbon, with his eye on the lady's answering teeth. "It's infernally hot, somehow," said I. "Let's go slower." "Oh, come along," said Gibbon. We picked our way among the bath chairs in the path. Many of the people sitting in the chairs seemed almost natural in their passive poses, but the contorted scarlet of the bandsmen was not a restful thing to see. A purple-faced gentleman was frozen in the midst of a violent struggle to refold his newspaper against the wind. There were many evidences that all these people, in their sluggish way, were exposed to a considerable breeze, a breeze that had no existence so far as our sensations went. We came out and walked a little way from the crowd and turned and regarded it. To see all that multitude changed to a picture, smitten rigid, as it were, into the semblance of realistic wax, was impossibly wonderful. It was absurd, of course, but it filled me with an irrational and exultant sense of superior advantage. Consider the wonder of it. All that I had said and thought and done since the stuff had begun to work in my veins had happened, so far as those people, so far as the world in general went, in the twinkling of an eye. "The new Accelerator," I began, but Gibbon interrupted me. "There's that infernal old woman," he said. "What old woman?" "Lives next door to me," said Gibbon. "Has a lapdog that yaps. Gods, the temptation is strong." There is something very boyish and impulsive about Gibbon at times. Before I could expostulate with him, he had dashed forward, snatched the unfortunate animal out of visible existence, and was running violently with it towards the cliff of the Leas. It was most extraordinary. The little brute, you know, didn't bark or wriggle or make the slightest sign of vitality. It kept quite stiffly in an attitude of somnambulant repose, and Gibbon held it by the neck. It was like running about with a dog of wood. "Gibbon!" I cried. "Put it down!" Then I said something else. "If you run like that, Gibbon," I cried, You'll set your clothes on fire. Your linen trousers are going brown as it is." He clapped his hand on his thigh and stood hesitating on the verge. "Gibbon," I cried, coming up, "put it down. This heat is too much. It's our running so. 2 or 3 miles a second. Friction of the air." "What?" he said, glancing at the dog. "Friction of the air," I shouted. "Friction of the air, going too fast, like meteorites and things, too hot. And Gibbon, I'm all over pricking and a sort of perspiration. You can see people stirring slightly. I believe the stuff's working off. Put that dog down." "Eh?" he said. "It's working off," I repeated. "We're too hot and the stuff's working off. I'm wet through." He stared at me, then at the band, the wheezy rattle of whose performance was certainly going faster. Then with a tremendous sweep of the arm he hurled the dog away from him, and it went spinning upward, still inanimate, and hung at last over the grouped parasols of a knot of chattering people. Gibbon was gripping my elbow. "By Jove," he cried, "I believe it is! A sort of hot pricking, and yes, that man's moving his pocket-handkerchief, perceptibly. We must get out of this sharp." But we could not get out of it sharply enough. Luckily, perhaps, for we might have run, and if we had run we should, I believe, have burst into flames. Almost certainly we should have burst into flames. You know, we had neither of us thought of that. But before we could even begin to run, the action of the drug had ceased. It was the business of a minute fraction of a second. The effect of the new accelerator passed like the drawing of a curtain, vanished in the movement of a hand. I heard Gibbon's voice in infinite alarm. "Sit down," he said, and flop, down upon the turf at the edge of the leas I sat, scorching as I sat. There is a patch of burnt grass there still where I sat down. The whole stagnation seemed to wake up as I did so. The disarticulated vibration of the band rushed together into a blast of music. The promenaders put their feet down and walked their ways. The papers and flags began flapping. Smiles passed into words. The winker finished his wink and went on his way complacently, and all the seated people moved and spoke. The whole world had come alive again, was going as fast as we were, or rather we were going no faster than the rest of the world. It was like slowing down as one comes to a railway station. Everything seemed to spin round for a second or two. I had the most transient feeling of nausea, and that was all. And the little dog, which had seemed to hang for a moment when the force of Gibbon's arm was expended, fell with a swift acceleration clean through a lady's parasol. That was the saving of us, unless it was for one corpulent old gentleman in a bath chair who certainly did start at the sight of us and afterwards regarded us at intervals with a darkly suspicious eye, and finally, I believe, said something to his nurse about us. I doubt if a solitary person remarked our sudden appearance among them. Plop! We must have appeared abruptly. We ceased to smoulder almost at once, though the turf beneath me was uncomfortably hot. The attention of everyone, including the Amusements Association band, which on this occasion, for the only time in its history, got out of tune, was arrested by the amazing fact, and the still more amazing yapping and uproar caused by the fact that a respectable, overfed lapdog sleeping quietly to the east of the bandstand should suddenly fall through the parasol of a lady on the west, in a slightly singed condition due to the extreme velocity of its movements through the air. In these absurd days, too, when people are all trying to be as psychic and silly and superstitious as possible. People got up and trod on other people, chairs were overturned, the Lees policeman ran. How the matter settled itself I do not know. We were much too anxious to disentangle ourselves from the affair and get out of range of the eye of the old gentleman in the bath chair to make minute inquiries. As soon as we were sufficiently cool and sufficiently recovered from our giddiness and nausea and confusion of mind to do so, we stood up, and, skirting the crowd, directed our steps back along the road below the metropole towards Gibbon's house. But amidst the din I heard very distinctly the gentleman who had been sitting beside the lady of the ruptured sunshade using quite unjustifiable threats and language to one of those chair attendants who have Inspector written on their caps. "If you didn't throw the dog," he said, "who did?" The sudden return of movement and familiar noises, and our natural anxiety about ourselves — our clothes were still dreadfully hot, and the fronts of the thighs of Gibbon's white trousers were scorched a drabbish brown — prevented the minute observations I should have liked to make on all these things. Indeed, I really made no observations of any scientific value on that return. The bee, of course, had gone. I looked for that cyclist, but he was already out of sight as we came into the upper Sandgate Road, or hidden from us by traffic. The caravanc, however, with its people now all alive and stirring, was clattering along at a spanking pace almost abreast of the nearer church. We noted, however, that the window-sill on which we had stepped in getting out of the house was slightly singed, and that the impressions of our feet on the gravel of the path were unusually deep. So it was I had my first experience of the new Accelerator. Practically, we had been running about and saying and doing all sorts of things in the space of a second or so of time. We had lived half an hour while the band had played perhaps 2 bars. But the effect it had upon us was that the whole world had stopped for our convenient inspection. Considering all things, and particularly considering our rashness in venturing out of the house, the experience might certainly have been much more disagreeable than it was. It showed, no doubt, that Gibbon has still much to learn before his preparation is a manageable convenience, but its practicability is certainly demonstrated beyond all cavil. Since that adventure he has been steadily bringing its use under control, and I have several times, and without the slightest bad result, taken measured doses under his direction, though I must confess I have not yet ventured abroad again while under its influence. I may mention, for example, that this story has been written at one sitting and without interruption, except for the nibbling of some chocolate by its means. I began at 6:25, and my watch is now very nearly at the minute past the half-hour. The convenience of securing a long, uninterrupted spell of work in the midst of a day full of engagements cannot be exaggerated. Gibbon is now working at the quantitative handling of his preparation, with especial reference to its distinctive effects upon different types of constitution. He then hopes to find a retarder with which to dilute its present rather excessive potency. The retarder will, of course, have the reverse effect to the Accelerator. Used alone, it should enable the patient to spread a few seconds over many hours of ordinary time, and so to maintain an apathetic inaction, a glacier-like absence of alacrity, amidst the most animated or irritating surroundings. The two things together must necessarily work an entire revolution in civilized existence. It is the beginning of our escape from that time garment of which Carlyle speaks. While this Accelerator will enable us to concentrate ourselves with tremendous impact upon any moment or occasion that demands our utmost sense and vigor, the retarder will enable us to pass in passive tranquillity through infinite hardship and tedium. Perhaps I am a little optimistic about the retarder, which has indeed still to be discovered. But about the Accelerator there is no possible sort of doubt whatever. Its appearance upon the market in a convenient, controllable, and assimilable form is a matter of the next few months. It will be obtainable of all chemists and druggists in small green bottles at a high but, considering its extraordinary qualities, by no means excessive price. Gibbon's Nervous Accelerator, it will be called, and he hopes to be able to supply it in 3 strengths, 1 in 200, 1 in 900, and 1 in 2000, distinguished by yellow, pink, and white labels, respectively. No doubt its use renders a great number of very extraordinary things possible, for of course the most remarkable and possibly even criminal proceedings may be effected with impunity by thus dodging, as it were, into the interstices of time. Like all potent preparations, it will be liable to abuse, We have, however, discussed this aspect of the question very thoroughly, and we have decided that this is purely a matter of medical jurisprudence and altogether outside our province. We shall manufacture and sell the Accelerator, and as for the consequences, we shall see.
The Crystal Egg. There was, until a year ago, a little and very grimy-looking shop near 7 Dials, over which, in weather-worn yellow lettering, the name of C. Cave, naturalist and dealer in antiquities, was inscribed. The contents of its window were curiously varied. They comprised some elephant tusks and an imperfect set of chessmen, beads and weapons, a box of eyes, 2 skulls of tigers and 1 human, several moth-eaten stuffed monkeys, 1 holding lamp, an old-fashioned cabinet, a fly-blown ostrich egg or so, some fishing tackle, and an extraordinarily dirty, empty glass fish tank. There was also, at the moment the story begins, a mass of crystal, worked into the shape of an egg and brilliantly polished, and at that 2 people, who stood outside the window, were looking, one of them a tall, thin clergyman, the other a black-bearded young man of dusky complexion and unobtrusive costume. The dusty young man spoke with eager gesticulation, and seemed anxious for his companion to purchase the article. While they were there, Mr. Cave came into his shop, his beard still wagging with the bread and butter of his tea. When he saw these men and the object of their regard, his countenance fell. He glanced guiltily over his shoulder, and softly shut the door. He was a little old man, with pale face and peculiar watery blue eyes. His hair was a dirty grey, and he wore a shabby blue frock-coat, an ancient silk hat, and carpet slippers very much down at heel. He remained watching the 2 men as they talked. The clergyman went deep into his trouser pocket, examined a handful of money, and showed his teeth in an agreeable smile. Mr. Cave seemed still more depressed when they came into the shop. The clergyman, without any ceremony, asked the price of the crystal egg. Mr. Cave glanced nervously towards the door leading into the parlour, and said £5. The clergyman protested that the price was high. To his companion, as well as to Mr. Cave, it was indeed very much more than Mr. Cave had intended to ask when he had stocked the article, and an attempt at bargaining ensued. Mr. Cave stepped to the shop door and held it open. £5 is my price, he said, as though he wished to save himself the trouble of unprofitable discussion. As he did so, the upper portion of a woman's face appeared above the blind in the glass upper panel of the door leading into the parlour, and stared curiously at the 2 customers. £5 is my price, said Mr. Cave, with a quiver in his voice. The swarthy young man had so far remained a spectator, watching Cave keenly. Now he spoke. "Give him £5, he said. The clergyman glanced at him to see if he were in earnest, and when he looked at Mr. Cave again, he saw that the latter's face was white. "It's a lot of money," said the clergyman, and diving into his pocket, began counting his resources. He had little more than 30 shillings, and he appealed to his companion, with whom he seemed to be on terms of considerable intimacy. This gave Mr. Cave an opportunity of collecting his thoughts, and he began to explain in an agitated manner that the crystal was not, as a matter of fact, entirely free for sale. His 2 customers were naturally surprised at this, and inquired why he had not thought of that before he began to bargain. Mr. Cave became confused, but he stuck to his story that the crystal was not in the market that afternoon, that a probable purchaser of it had already appeared. The two, treating this as an attempt to raise the price still further, made as if they would leave the shop. But at this point the parlor door opened, and the owner of the dark fringe and the little eyes appeared. She was a coarse-featured, corpulent woman, younger and very much larger than Mr. Cave. She walked heavily, and her face was flushed. "That crystal is for sale," she said, "and £5 is a good enough price for it. I can't think what you're about, Cave, not to take the gentleman's offer." Mr. Cave, greatly perturbed by the interruption, looked angrily at her over the rims of his spectacles, and without excessive assurance asserted his right to manage his business in his own way. An altercation began. The two customers watched the scene with interest and some amusement, occasionally assisting Mrs. Cave with suggestions. Mr. Cave, hard driven, persisted in a confused and impossible story of an enquiry for the crystal that morning, and his agitation became painful. But he stuck to his point with extraordinary persistence. It was the young Oriental who ended this curious controversy. He proposed that they should call again in the course of 2 days, so as to give the alleged enquirer a fair chance. "And then we must insist," said the clergyman. £5. Mrs. Cave took it on herself to apologize for her husband, explaining that he was sometimes a little odd, and as the two customers left, the couple prepared for a free discussion of the incident in all its bearings. Mrs. Cave talked to her husband with singular directness. The poor little man, quivering with emotion, muddled himself between his stories, maintaining on the one hand that he had another customer in view, and on the other asserting that the crystal was honestly worth 10 guineas. "Why did you ask £5?" said his wife. "Do let me manage my business my own way," said Mr. Cave. Mr. Cave had living with him a step-daughter and a step-son, and at supper that night the transaction was rediscussed. None of them had a high opinion of Mr. Cave's business methods, and this action seemed a culminating folly. "It's my opinion he's refused that crystal before," said the step-son, a loose-limbed lout of 18. "But £5?" said the step-daughter, an argumentative young woman of 26. Mr. Cave's answers were wretched. He could only mumble weak assertions that he knew his own business best. They drove him from his half-eaten supper into the shop to close it for the night, his ears aflame and tears of vexation behind his spectacles. Why had he left the crystal in the window so long? The folly of it! That was the trouble closest in his mind. For a time he could see no way of evading sale. After supper his step-daughter and step-son smartened themselves up and went out, and his wife retired upstairs to reflect upon the business aspects of the crystal, over a little sugar and lemon and so forth in hot water. Mr. Cave went into the shop and stayed there until late, ostensibly to make ornamental rockeries for goldfish cases, but really for a private purpose that will be better explained later. The next day Mrs. Cave found that the crystal had been removed from the window and was lying behind some second-hand books on angling. She replaced it in a conspicuous position, but she did not argue further about it, as a nervous headache disinclined her from debate. Mr. Cave was always disinclined. The day passed disagreeably. Mr. Cave was, if anything, more absent-minded than usual, and uncommonly irritable withal. In the afternoon, when his wife was taking her customary sleep, he removed the crystal from the window again. The next day, Mr. Cave had to deliver a consignment of dogfish at one of the hospital schools, where they were needed for dissection. In his absence, Mrs. Cave's mind reverted to the topic of the crystal, and the methods of expenditure suitable to a windfall of £5. She had already devised some very agreeable expedients, among others a dress of green silk for herself and a trip to Richmond, when a jangling of the front door-bell summoned her into the shop. The customer was an examination coach who came to complain of the non-delivery of certain frogs asked for the previous day. Mrs. Cave did not approve of this particular branch of Mr. Cave's business, and the gentleman who had called in a somewhat aggressive mood retired after a brief exchange of words, entirely civil so far as he was concerned. Mrs. Cave's eye then naturally turned to the window, for the sight of the crystal was an assurance of the £5 and of her dreams. What was her surprise to find it gone! She went to the place behind the locker on the counter, where she had discovered it the day before. It was not there, and she immediately began an eager search about the shop. When Mr. Cave returned from his business with the dogfish, about 1:45 in the afternoon, he found the shop in some confusion, and his wife, extremely exasperated and on her knees behind the counter, rooting among his taxidermic material. Her face came up hot and angry over the counter as the jangling bell announced his return, and she forthwith accused him of hiding it. "Hid what?" asked Mr. Cave. "The crystal." At that Mr. Cave, apparently much surprised, rushed to the window. "Isn't it here?" he said. "Great heavens, what has become of it?" Just then Mr. Cave's stepson re-entered the shop from the inner room. He had come home a minute or so before Mr. Cave, and he was blaspheming freely. He was apprenticed to a second-hand furniture dealer down the road, but he had his meals at home, and he was naturally annoyed to find no dinner ready. But when he heard of the loss of the crystal, he forgot his meal, and his anger was diverted from his mother to his stepfather. Their first idea, of course, was that he had hidden it, but Mr. Cave stoutly denied all knowledge of its fate, freely offering his bedabbled affidavit in the matter, and at last was worked up to the point of accusing first his wife and then his stepson of having taken it with a view to a private sale. So began an exceedingly acrimonious and emotional discussion, which ended for Mrs. Cave in a peculiar nervous condition midway between hysterics and amuck, and caused the stepson to be half an hour late at the furniture establishment in the afternoon. Mr. Cave took refuge from his wife's emotions in the shop. In the evening the matter was resumed, with less passion and in a judicial spirit, under the presidency of the stepdaughter. The supper passed unhappily and culminated in a painful scene. Mr. Cave gave way at last to extreme exasperation, and went out banging the front door violently. The rest of the family, having discussed him with the freedom his absence warranted, hunted the house from garret to cellar, hoping to light upon the crystal. The next day the two customers called again. They were received by Mrs. Cave almost in tears. It transpired that no one could imagine all that she had stood from Cave at various times in her married pilgrimage. She also gave a garbled account of the disappearance. The clergyman and the Oriental laughed silently at one another, and said it was very extraordinary. As Mrs. Cave seemed disposed to give them the complete history of his life, they made to leave the shop. Thereupon Mrs. Cave, still clinging to hope, asked for the clergyman's address, so that, if she could get anything out of Cave, she might communicate it. The address was duly given, but apparently was afterwards mislaid. Mrs. Cave can remember nothing about it. In the evening of that day the Caves seemed to have exhausted their emotions, and Mr. Cave, who had been out in the afternoon, supped in a gloomy isolation that contrasted pleasantly with the impassioned controversy of previous days. For some time matters were very badly strained in the Cave household, but neither crystal nor customer reappeared. Now, without mincing the matter, we must admit that Mr. Cave was a liar. He knew perfectly well where the crystal was. It was in the rooms of Mr. Jacoby Wace, assistant demonstrator at St. Catherine's Hospital, Westbourne Street. It stood on the sideboard, partially covered by a black velvet cloth, and beside a decanter of American whiskey. It is from Mr. Wace, indeed, that the particulars upon which this narrative is based were derived. Cave had taken off the thing to the hospital hidden in the dogfish sack, and there had pressed the young investigator to keep it for him. Mr. Wace was a little dubious at first. His relationship to Cave was peculiar. He had a taste for singular characters, and he had more than once invited the old man to smoke and drink in his rooms, and to unfold his rather amusing views of life in general, and of his wife in particular. Mr. Wace had encountered Mrs. Cave, too, on occasions when Mr. Cave was not at home to attend to him. He knew the constant interference to which Cave was subjected, and having weighed the story judicially, he decided to give the crystal a refuge. Mr. Cave promised to explain the reasons for his remarkable affection for the crystal more fully on a later occasion, but he spoke distinctly of seeing visions therein. He called on Mr. Wace the same evening. He told a complicated story. The crystal, he said, had come into his possession with other oddments at the forced sale of another curiosity dealer's effects, and not knowing what its value might be, he had ticketed it at 10 shillings. It had hung upon his hands at that price for some months, and he was thinking of reducing the figure when he made a singular discovery. At that time his health was very bad, and it must be borne in mind that throughout all this experience his physical condition was one of ebb, and he was in considerable distress by reason of the negligence, the positive ill treatment even, he received from his wife and stepchildren. His wife was vain, extravagant, unfeeling, and had a growing taste for private drinking. His stepdaughter was mean and overreaching, and his stepson had conceived a violent dislike for him, and lost no chance of showing it. The requirements of his business pressed heavily upon him, and Mr. Wace does not think that he was altogether free from occasional intemperance. He had begun life in a comfortable position. He was a man of fair education, and he suffered for weeks at a stretch from melancholia and insomnia. Afraid to disturb his family, he would slip quietly from his wife's side when his thoughts became intolerable, and wander about the house. And about 3 o'clock one morning, late in August, chance directed him into the shop. The dirty little place was impenetrably black except in one spot, where he perceived an unusual glow of light. Approaching this, he discovered it to be the crystal egg, which was standing on the corner of the counter towards the window. A thin ray smote through a crack in the shutters, impinged upon the object, and seemed as it were to fill its entire interior. It occurred to Mr. Cave that this was not in accordance with the laws of optics as he had known them in his younger days. He could understand the rays being refracted by the crystal and coming to a focus in its interior, but this diffusion jarred with his physical conceptions. He approached the crystal nearly, peering into it and round it, with a transient revival of the scientific curiosity that in his youth had determined his choice of a calling. He was surprised to find the light not steady, but writhing within the substance of the egg, as though that object was a hollow sphere of some luminous vapor. In moving about to get different points of view, he suddenly found that he had come between it and the ray, and that the crystal none the less remained luminous. Greatly astonished, he lifted it out of the light ray and carried it to the darkest part of the shop. It remained bright for some 4 or 5 minutes, when it slowly faded and went out. He placed it in the thin streak of daylight, and its luminousness was almost immediately restored. So far, at least, Mr. Wace was able to verify the remarkable story of Mr. Cave. He has himself repeatedly held this crystal in a ray of light, which had to be of a less diameter than 1 millimeter, and in a perfect darkness such as could be produced by velvet wrapping, the crystal did undoubtedly appear very faintly phosphorescent. It would seem, however, that the luminousness was of some exceptional sort, and not equally visible to all eyes, for Mr. Harbinger, whose name will be familiar to the scientific reader in connection with the Pasteur Institute, was quite unable to see any light whatever, and Mr. Wace's own capacity for its appreciation was out of comparison inferior to that of Mr. Cave's. Even with Mr. Cave the power varied very considerably. His vision was most vivid during states of extreme weakness and fatigue. Now, from the outset, this light in the crystal exercised an irresistible fascination upon Mr. Cave. and it says more for his loneliness of soul than a volume of pathetic writing could do, that he told no human being of his curious observations. He seems to have been living in such an atmosphere of petty spite that to admit the existence of a pleasure would have been to risk the loss of it. He found that as the dawn advanced, and the amount of diffused light increased, the crystal became to all appearance non-luminous, and for some time he was unable to see anything in it except at night time, in the dark corners of the shop. But the use of an old velvet cloth, which he used as a background for a collection of minerals, occurred to him, and by doubling this, and putting it over his head and hands, he was able to get a sight of the luminous movement within the crystal, even in the daytime. He was very cautious lest he should be thus discovered by his wife, and he practiced this occupation only in the afternoons while she was asleep upstairs, and then circumspectly in a hollow under the counter. And one day, turning the crystal about in his hands, he saw something. It came and went like a flash, but it gave him the impression that the object had for a moment opened to him the view of a wide and spacious and strange country. And turning it about, he did, just as the light faded, see the same vision again. Now, it would be tedious and unnecessary to state all the phases of Mr. Cave's discovery from this point. Suffice that the effect was this. The crystal, being peered into at an angle of about 137 degrees from the direction of the illuminating ray, gave a clear and consistent picture of a wide and peculiar countryside. It was not dreamlike at all. It produced a definite impression of reality, and the better the light, the more real and solid it seemed. It was a moving picture. That is to say, certain objects moved in it, but slowly, in an orderly manner, like real things, and according as the direction of the lighting and vision changed, the picture changed also. It must indeed have been like looking through an oval glass at a view, and turning the glass about to get at different aspects. Mr. Cave's statements, Mr. Wace assures me, were extremely circumstantial, and entirely free from any of that emotional quality that taints hallucinatory impressions. But it must be remembered that all the efforts of Mr. Wace to see any similar clarity in the faint opalescence of the crystal were wholly unsuccessful, try as he would. The difference in intensity of the impressions received by the two men was very great, and it is quite conceivable that what was a view to Mr. Cave was a mere blurred nebulosity to Mr. Wace. The view, as Mr. Cave described it, was invariably of an extensive plain, and he seemed always to be looking at it from a considerable height, as if from a tower or a mast. To the east and to the west the plain was bounded at a remote distance by vast reddish cliffs, which reminded him of those he had seen in some picture, but what the picture was, Mr. Wace was unable to ascertain. These cliffs passed north and south. He could tell the points of the compass by the stars that were visible of a night, receding in an almost illimitable perspective, and fading into the mists of the distance before they met. He was nearer the eastern set of cliffs. On the occasion of his first vision the sun was rising over them, and black against the sunlight and pale against their shadow appeared a multitude of soaring forms that Mr. Cave regarded as birds. A vast range of buildings spread below him. He seemed to be looking down upon them, and as they approached the blurred and refracted edge of the picture, they became indistinct. There were also trees, curious in shape and in coloring, a deep mossy green and an exquisite gray, beside a wide and shining canal. And something great and brilliantly colored flew across the picture. But the first time Mr. Cave saw these pictures he saw only in flashes. His hands shook. His head moved. The vision came and went, and grew foggy and indistinct. And at first he had the greatest difficulty in finding the picture again once the direction of it was lost. His next clear vision, which came about a week after the first, the interval having yielded nothing but tantalizing glimpses and some useful experience, showed him the view down the length of the valley. The view was different, but he had a curious persuasion, which his subsequent observations abundantly confirmed, that he was regarding this strange world from exactly the same spot, although he was looking in a different direction. The long facade of the great building, whose roof he had looked down upon before, was now receding in perspective. He recognized the roof. In the front of the facade was a terrace of massive proportions and extraordinary length, and down the middle of the terrace, at certain intervals, stood huge but very graceful masts, bearing small shiny objects which reflected the setting sun. The import of these small objects did not occur to Mr. Cave until some time after, as he was describing the scene to Mr. Wace. The terrace overhung a thicket of the most luxuriant and graceful vegetation, and beyond this was a wide grassy lawn on which certain broad creatures, in form like beetles but enormously larger, reposed. Beyond this again was a richly decorated causeway of pinkish stone, and beyond that, and lined with dense red weeds, and passing up the valley exactly parallel with the distant cliffs, was a broad and mirror-like expanse of water. The air seemed full of squadrons of great birds, maneuvering in stately curves, and across the river was a multitude of splendid buildings, richly colored and glittering with metallic tracery and facets, among a forest of moss-like and lichenous trees. And suddenly something flapped repeatedly across the vision, like the fluttering of a jeweled fan, or the beating of a wing, and a face, or rather the upper part of a face with very large eyes, came as it were close to his own, and as if on the other side of the crystal. Mr. Cave was so startled and so impressed by the absolute reality of these eyes, that he drew his head back from the crystal to look behind it. He had become so absorbed in watching that he was quite surprised to find himself in the cool darkness of his little shop, with its familiar odor of methyl, mustiness, and decay. And as he blinked about him, the glowing crystal faded and went out. Such were the first general impressions of Mr. Cave. The story is curiously direct and circumstantial. From the outset, when the valley first flashed momentarily on his senses, his imagination was strangely affected, and as he began to appreciate the details of the scene he saw, his wonder rose to the point of a passion. He went about his business listless and distraught, thinking only of the time when he should be able to return to his watching. And then a few weeks after his first sight of the valley came the two customers, the stress and excitement of their offer, and the narrow escape of the crystal from sale, as I have already told. Now, while the thing was Mr. Cave's secret, it remained a mere wonder, a thing to creep to covertly and peep at, as a child might peep upon a forbidden garden. But Mr. Wace has, for a young scientific investigator, a particularly lucid and consecutive habit of mind. Directly the crystal and its story came to him, and he had satisfied himself, by seeing the phosphorescence with his own eyes, that there really was a certain evidence for Mr. Cave's statements, he proceeded to develop the matter systematically. Mr. Cave was only too eager to come and feast his eyes upon this wonderland he saw, and he came every night from 8:30 until 10:30, and sometimes in Mr. Wace's absence during the day. On Sunday afternoons also he came. From the outset Mr. Wace made copious notes, and it was due to his scientific method that the relation between the direction from which the initiating ray entered the crystal and the orientation of the picture was proved. And by covering the crystal in a box perforated only with a small aperture to admit the exciting ray, and by substituting black holland for his buff blinds, he greatly improved the conditions of the observations, so that in a little while they were able to survey the valley in any direction they desired. So, having cleared the way, we may give a brief account of this visionary world within the crystal. The things were all in cases seen by Mr. Cave, and the method of working was invariably for him to watch the crystal and report what he saw, while Mr. Wace, who as a science student had learnt the trick of writing in the dark, wrote a brief note of his report. When the crystal faded, it was put into its box in the proper position and the electric light turned on. Mr. Wace asked questions and suggested observations to clear up difficult points. Nothing, indeed, could have been less visionary and more matter-of-fact. The attention of Mr. Cave had been speedily directed to the bird-like creatures he had seen so abundantly present in each of his earlier visions. His first impression was soon corrected, and he considered for a time that they might represent a diurnal species of bat. Then he thought, grotesquely enough, that they might be cherubs. Their heads were round and curiously human, and it was the eyes of one of them that had so startled him on his second observation. They had broad silvery wings, not feathered, but glistening almost as brilliantly as new-killed fish, and with the same subtle play of colour. And these wings were not built on the plan of bird wing or bat, Mr. Wace learned, but supported by curved ribs radiating from the body. A sort of butterfly wing with curved ribs seems best to express their appearance. The body was small, but fitted with two bunches of prehensile organs like long tentacles, immediately under the mouth. Incredible as it appeared to Mr. Wace, the persuasion at last became irresistible that it was these creatures which owned the great quasi-human buildings and the magnificent garden that made the broad valley so splendid. And Mr. Cave perceived that the buildings, with other peculiarities, had no doors, but that the great circular windows, which opened freely, gave the creatures egress and entrance. They would alight upon their tentacles, fold their wings to a smallness almost rod-like, and hop into the interior. But among them was a multitude of smaller winged creatures, like great dragonflies and moths and flying beetles, and across the greensward brilliantly coloured gigantic ground beetles crawled lazily to and fro. Moreover, on the causeways and terraces, large-headed creatures similar to the greater winged flies, but wingless, were visible, hopping busily upon their hand-like tangle of tentacles. Allusion has already been made to the glittering objects upon masts that stood upon the terrace of the nearer building. It dawned upon Mr. Cave, after regarding one of these masts very fixedly on one particularly vivid day, that the glittering object there was a crystal exactly like that into which he peered. And a still more careful scrutiny convinced him that each one in a vista of nearly 20 carried a similar object. Occasionally one of the large flying creatures would flutter up to one, and folding its wings and coiling a number of its tentacles about the mast, would regard the crystal fixedly for a space, sometimes for as long as 15 minutes. And a series of observations made at the suggestion of Mr. Wace convinced both watchers that, so far as this visionary world was concerned, the crystal into which they peered actually stood at the summit of the endmost mast on the terrace, and that on one occasion at least, one of these inhabitants of this other world had looked into Mr. Cave's face while he was making these observations. So much for the essential facts of this very singular story. Unless we dismiss it all as the ingenious fabrication of Mr. Wace, we have to believe one of two things: either that Mr. Cave's crystal was in two worlds at once, and that, while it was carried about in one, it remained stationary in the other, which seems altogether absurd, or else that it had some peculiar relation of sympathy with another and exactly similar crystal in this other world, so that what was seen in the interior of the one in this world was, under suitable conditions, visible to an observer in the corresponding crystal in the other world, and vice versa. At present, indeed, we do not know any way in which two crystals could so come en rapport, but nowadays we know enough to understand that the thing is not altogether impossible. This view of the crystals as en rapport was the supposition that occurred to Mr. Wace, and to me, at least, it seems extremely plausible. and where was this other world? On this also the alert intelligence of Mr. Wace speedily threw light. After sunset the sky darkened rapidly. There was a very brief twilight interval indeed, and the stars shone out. They were recognizably the same as those we see, arranged in the same constellations. Mr. Cave recognized the Bear, the Pleiades, Aldebaran, and Sirius, so that the other world must be somewhere in the solar system, and at the utmost only a few hundreds of millions of miles from our own. Following up this clue, Mr. Wace learned that the midnight sky was a darker blue even than our midwinter sky, and that the sun seemed a little smaller. And there were 2 small moons, like our moon, but smaller and quite differently marked, one of which moved so rapidly that its motion was clearly visible as one regarded it. These moons were never high in the sky, but vanished as they rose. That is, every time they revolved, they were eclipsed because they were so near their primary planet. And all this answers quite completely, although Mr. Cave did not know it, to what must be the condition of things on Mars. Indeed, it seems an exceedingly plausible conclusion that peering into this crystal Mr. Cave did actually see the planet Mars and its inhabitants. And if that be the case, then the evening star that shone so brightly in the sky of that distant vision was neither more nor less than our own familiar Earth. For a time, the Martians, if they were Martians, do not seem to have known of Mr. Cave's inspection. Once or twice one would come to peer and go away very shortly to some other mast, as though the vision was unsatisfactory. During this time, Mr. Cave was able to watch the proceedings of these winged people without being disturbed by their attentions, and although his report is necessarily vague and fragmentary, it is nevertheless very suggestive. Imagine the impression of humanity a Martian observer would get who, after a difficult process of preparation and with considerable fatigue to the eyes, was able to peer at London from the steeple of St. Martin's Church for stretches at longest of 4 minutes at a time. Mr. Cave was unable to ascertain if the winged Martians were the same as the Martians who hopped about the causeways and terraces, and if the latter could put on wings at will. He several times saw certain clumsy bipeds dimly suggestive of apes, white and partially translucent, feeding among certain of the lichenous trees, and once some of these fled before one of the hopping, round-headed Martians. The latter caught one in its tentacles, and then the picture faded suddenly, and left Mr. Cave most tantalizingly in the dark. On another occasion, a vast thing, that Mr. Cave thought at first was some gigantic insect, appeared advancing along the causeway beside the canal with extraordinary rapidity. As this drew nearer, Mr. Cave perceived that it was a mechanism of shining metals and of extraordinary complexity. And then, when he looked again, it had passed out of sight. After a time, Mr. Wace aspired to attract the attention of the Martians, and the next time that the strange eyes of one of them appeared close to the crystal, Mr. Cave cried out and sprang away, and they immediately turned on the light and began to gesticulate in a manner suggestive of signaling. But when at last Mr. Cave examined the crystal again, the Martian had departed. Thus far these observations had progressed in early November, and then Mr. Cave, feeling that the suspicions of his family about the crystal were allayed, began to take it to and fro with him in order that, as occasion arose in the daytime or night, he might comfort himself with what was fast becoming the most real thing in his existence. In December, Mr. Wace's work in connection with a forthcoming examination became heavy. The sittings were reluctantly suspended for a week, and for 10 or 11 days, he is not quite sure which, he saw nothing of Cave. He then grew anxious to resume these investigations, and the stress of his seasonal labors being abated, he went down to 7 Dials. At the corner he noticed a shutter before a bird fancier's window, and then another at a cobbler's. Mr. Cave's shop was closed. He rapped, and the door was opened by the stepson in black. He at once called Mrs. Cave, who was, Mr. Wace could not but observe, in cheap but ample widow's weeds of the most imposing pattern. Without any great surprise, Mr. Wace learnt that Cave was dead, and already buried. She was in tears, and her voice was a little thick. She had just returned from Highgate. Her mind seemed occupied with her own prospects and the honourable details of the obsequies, but Mr. Wace was at last able to learn the particulars of Cave's death. He had been found dead in his shop in the early morning, the day after his last visit to Mr. Wace, and the crystal had been clasped in his stone-cold hands. His face was smiling, said Mrs. Cave, and the velvet cloth from the minerals lay on the floor at his feet. He must have been dead 5 or 6 hours when he was found. This came as a great shock to Wace, and he began to reproach himself bitterly for having neglected the plain symptoms of the old man's ill health. But his chief thought was of the crystal. He approached that topic in a gingerly manner because he knew Mrs. Cave's peculiarities. He was dumbfounded to learn that it was sold. Mrs. Cave's first impulse, directly Cave's body had been taken upstairs, had been to write to the mad clergyman who had offered £5 for the crystal, informing him of its recovery. But after a violent hunt in which her daughter joined her, they were convinced of the loss of his address. As they were without the means required to mourn and bury Cave in the elaborate style of the dignity of an old Seven Dials inhabitant demands, they had appealed to a friendly fellow tradesman in Great Portland Street. He had very kindly taken over a portion of the stock at a valuation. The valuation was his own, and the crystal egg was included in one of the lots. Mr. Wace, after a few suitable consolatory observations, a little off-handedly proffered perhaps, hurried at once to Great Portland Street. But there he learned that the crystal egg had already been sold to a tall, dark man in grey. And there the material facts in this curious, and to me at least very suggestive story, come abruptly to an end. The Great Portland Street dealer did not know who the tall, dark man in grey was, nor had he observed him with sufficient attention to describe him minutely. He did not even know which way this person had gone after leaving the shop. For a time Mr. Wace remained in the shop, trying the dealer's patience with hopeless questions, venting his own exasperation. And at last, realizing abruptly that the whole thing had passed out of his hands, had vanished like a vision of the night, he returned to his own rooms, a little astonished to find the notes he had made still tangible and visible upon his untidy table. His annoyance and disappointment were naturally very great. He made a second call, equally ineffectual, upon the Great Portland Street dealer, and he resorted to advertisements in such periodicals as were likely to come into the hands of a bric-a-brac collector. He also wrote letters to the Daily Chronicle and Nature, but both those periodicals, suspecting a hoax, asked him to reconsider his action before they printed, and he was advised that such a strange story, unfortunately so bare of supporting evidence, might imperil his reputation as an investigator. Moreover, the calls of his proper work were urgent, so that after a month or so, save for an occasional reminder to certain dealers, he had reluctantly to abandon the quest for the crystal egg, and from that day to this it remains undiscovered. Occasionally, however, he tells me, and I can quite believe him, he has bursts of zeal in which he abandons his more urgent occupation and resumes the search. Whether or not it will remain lost forever, with the material and origin of it, are things equally speculative at the present time. If the present purchaser is a collector, one would have expected the inquiries of Mr. Wace to have reached him through the dealers. He has been able to discover Mr. Cave's clergyman and Oriental, no other than the Reverend James Parker and the young Prince of Basso Cuni in Java. I am obliged to them for certain particulars. The object of the prince was simply curiosity and extravagance. He was so eager to buy because Cave was so oddly reluctant to sell. It is just as possible that the buyer in the second instance was simply a casual purchaser and not a collector at all. And the crystal egg, for all I know, may at the present moment be within a mile of me, decorating a drawing-room or serving as a paperweight, its remarkable functions all unknown. Indeed, it is partly with the idea of such a possibility that I have thrown this narrative into a form that will give it a chance of being read by the ordinary consumer of fiction. My own ideas in the matter are practically identical with those of Mr. Wace. I believe the crystal on the mast in Mars and the crystal egg of Mr. Cave's to be in some physical, but at present quite inexplicable, way en rapport. And we both believe further that the terrestrial crystal must have been, possibly at some remote date, sent hither from that planet in order to give the Martians a near view of our affairs. Possibly the fellows to the crystals in the other masts are also on our globe. No theory of hallucination suffices for the facts.
The Empire of the Ants, Part 1. When Captain Garrilo received instructions to take his new gunboat, the Benjamin Constant, to Badama on the Batimo arm of the Guaramadima, and there assist the inhabitants against a plague of ants, he suspected the authorities of mockery. His promotion had been romantic and irregular. The affections of a prominent Brazilian lady and the captain's liquid eyes had played a part in the process, and the Diario and the O Futuro had been lamentably disrespectful in their comments. He felt he was to give further occasion for disrespect. He was a Creole. His conceptions of etiquette and discipline were pure-blooded Portuguese, and it was only to Holroyd, the Lancashire engineer, who had come over with the boat, and as an exercise in the use of his English, his th sounds were very uncertain, that he opened his heart. "It is in effect," he said, "to make me absurd. What can a man do against ants? They come, they go." "They say," said Holroyd, "that these don't go. That chap you said was a Sambo?" "Zambo. It is a sort of mixture of blood." "Sambo. He said the people are going." The captain smoked fretfully for a time. "These things have to happen," he said at last. "What is it? Plagues of ants and such like as God wills. There was a plague in Trinidad, the little ants that carry leaves. Older orange trees, older mangoes. What does it matter? Sometimes ant armies come into your houses, fighting ants, a different sort. You go and they clean the house. Then you come back again. The house is clean, like new. No cockroaches, no fleas, no jiggers on the floor." "That Sambo chap," said Holroyd, "says these are a different sort of ant." The captain shrugged his shoulders, fumed, and gave his attention to a cigarette. Afterwards he reopened the subject. "My dear Holroyd, what am I to do about these infernal ants?" The captain reflected. "It is ridiculous," he said. But in the afternoon he put on his full uniform and went ashore, and jars and boxes came back to the ship, and subsequently he did. And Holroyd sat on deck in the evening coolness and smoked profoundly and marveled at Brazil. They were 6 days up the Amazon, some hundreds of miles from the ocean, and east and west of him there was a horizon like the sea, and to the south nothing but a sandbank island with some tufts of scrub. The water was always running like a sluice, thick with dirt, animated with crocodiles and hovering birds, and fed by some inexhaustible source of tree trunks. And the waste of it, the headlong waste of it, filled his soul. The town of Alamkay, with its meager church, its thatched sheds for houses, its discolored ruins of ampler days, seemed a little thing lost in this wilderness of nature, a sixpence dropped on Sahara. He was a young man. This was his first sight of the tropics. He came straight from England, where nature is hedged, ditched, and drained into the perfection of submission, and he had suddenly discovered the insignificance of man. For 6 days they had been steaming up from the sea by unfrequented channels, and man had been as rare as a rare butterfly. One saw one day a canoe, another day a distant station, the next no men at all. He began to perceive that man is indeed a rare animal, having but a precarious hold upon this land. He perceived it more clearly as the days passed, and he made his devious way to the Patimo, in the company of this remarkable commander, who ruled over one big gun and was forbidden to waste his ammunition. Holroyd was learning Spanish industriously, but he was still in the present tense and substantive stage of speech, and the only other person who had any words of English was a Negro stoker, who had them all wrong. The second in command was a Portuguese, Dercum, who spoke French, but it was a different sort of French from the French Holroyd had learned in Southport, and their intercourse was confined to politenesses and simple propositions about the weather. And the weather, like everything else in this amazing new world, the weather had no human aspect, and was hot by night and hot by day, and the air steam. Even the wind was hot steam, smelling of vegetation in decay, and the alligators and the strange birds, the flies of many sorts and sizes, the beetles, the ants, the snakes, and monkeys seemed to wonder what man was doing in an atmosphere that had no gladness in its sunshine and no coolness in its night. To wear clothing was intolerable, but to cast it aside was to scorch by day, and expose an ampler area to the mosquitoes by night. To go on deck by day was to be blinded by glare, and to stay below was to suffocate. And in the daytime came certain flies, extremely clever and noxious about one's wrist and ankle. Captain Garrillo, who was Holroyd's sole distraction from these physical distresses, developed into a formidable bore, telling the simple story of his heart's affections day by day, a string of anonymous women, as if he was telling beads. Sometimes he suggested sport, and they shot at alligators, and at rare intervals they came to human aggregations in the waste of trees, and stayed for a day or so, and drank and sat about, and one night danced with Creole girls who found Holroyd's poor elements of Spanish, without either past tense or future, amply sufficient for their purposes. But these were luminous chinks in the long grey passage of the streaming river, up which the throbbing engines beat. A certain liberal heathen deity, in the shape of a demijohn, held seductive court aft, and, it is probable, forward. But Garrillo learned things about the ants, more things and more, at this stopping place and that, and became interested in his mission. "They are a new sort of ant," he said. "We have got to be, what do you call it? Entomology? Big? 5 centimeters. Some bigger. It is ridiculous. We are like the monkeys, sent to pick insects. But they are eating up the country." He burst out indignantly. "Suppose suddenly there are complications with Europe. Here I am. Soon we shall be above the Rio Negro, and my gun useless." He nursed his knee and mused. "Those people who were there at the dancing place, they have come down. They have lost all they got. The ants come to their houses one afternoon. Everyone run out. You know, when the ants come, one must. Everyone runs out, and they go over the house. If you stayed, they'd eat you. See? Well, presently they go back. They say the ants have gone. The ants haven't gone. They try to go in. The sun, he goes in. The ants fight. Swarm over him. Bite him. Presently he comes out again, screaming and running. He runs past them to the river. See? He get into the water and drowns the ants. Yes,
Garrilo paused, brought his liquid eyes close to Holroyd's face, tapped Holroyd's knee with his knuckle. "That night he dies, just as if he was stung by a snake." "Poisoned by the ants?" "Who knows?" Garrilo shrugged his shoulders. "Perhaps they bit him badly. When I joined the service, I joined to fight men. These things, these ants, they come and go. It is no business for men." After that, he talked frequently of the ants to Holroyd, and whenever they chanced to drift against any speck of humanity in that waste of water and sunshine and distant trees, Holroyd's improving knowledge of the language enabled him to recognize the ascendant word "soba," more and more completely dominating the whole. He perceived the ants were becoming interesting, and the nearer he drew to them, the more interesting they became. Garrilo abandoned his old themes almost suddenly, and the Portuguese lieutenant became a conversational figure. He knew something about the leaf-cutting ant, and expanded his knowledge. Garrilo sometimes rendered what he had to tell to Holroyd. He told of the little workers that swarm and fight, and the big workers that command and rule, and how these latter always crawled to the neck, and how their bites drew blood. He told how they cut leaves and made fungus beds, and how their nests in Caracas are sometimes 100 yards across. 2 days the three men spent disputing whether ants have eyes. The discussion grew dangerously heated on the second afternoon, and Holroyd saved the situation by going ashore in a boat to catch ants and see. He captured various specimens and returned, and some had eyes and some hadn't. Also, they argued, do ants bite or sting? "These ants," said Garrilo after collecting information at a rancho, "have big eyes. They don't run about blind, not as most ants do. No, they get in corners and watch what you do." "And they sting?" asked Holroyd. "Yes, they sting. There is poison in the sting." He meditated. "I do not see what men can do against ants. They come and go." "But these don't go." "They will," said Garrilo. Past Tamandu there is a long, low coast of 80 miles without any population, and then one comes to the confluence of the main river and the Batimo arm like a great lake, and then the forest came at last intimately near. The character of the channel changes, snags abound, and the Benjamin Constant moored by a cable that night under the very shadow of dark trees. For the first time for many days came a spell of coolness, and Holroyd and Garrilo sat smoking cigars and enjoying this delicious sensation. Garrilo's mind was full of ants and what they could do. He decided to sleep at last, and lay down on a mattress on deck, a man hopelessly perplexed. His last words, when he already seemed asleep, were to ask, with a flourish of despair, "What can one do with ants? The whole thing is absurd." Holroyd was left to scratch his bitten wrists and meditate alone. He sat on the bulwark and listened to the changes in Garrilo's breathing until he was fast asleep, and then the ripple and lap of the stream took his mind and brought back that sense of immensity that had been growing upon him since first he had left Para and come up the river. The monitor showed but one small light, and there was first a little talking forward, and then stillness. His eyes went from the dim black outlines of the middle works of the gunboat towards the bank, to the black overwhelming mysteries of forest, lit now and then by a firefly, and never still from the murmur of alien and mysterious activities. It was the inhuman immensity of this land that astonished and oppressed him. He knew the skies were empty of men, the stars were specks in an incredible vastness of space. He knew the ocean was enormous and untamable. But in England he had come to think of the land as man's. In England it is indeed man's. The wild things live by sufferance, grow on lease, everywhere the roads, the fences, and absolute security runs. In an atlas, too, the land is man's, and all colored to show his claim to it, in vivid contrast to the universal independent blueness of the sea. He had taken it for granted that a day would come when everywhere about the earth plow and culture, light tramways and good roads, and ordered security would prevail. But now he doubted. This forest was interminable. It had an air of being invincible, and man seemed at best an infrequent precarious intruder. One traveled for miles amidst the still, silent struggle of giant trees, of strangulating creepers, of assertive flowers. Everywhere the alligator, the turtle, and endless varieties of birds and insects seemed at home, dwelt irreplaceably. But man at most held a footing upon resentful clearings, fought weeds, fought beasts and insects for the barest foothold, fell a prey to snake and beast, insect and fever, and was presently carried away. In many places down the river he had been manifestly driven back. This deserted creek or that preserved the name of a casa, and here and there ruinous white walls and a shattered tower enforced the lesson. The puma, the jaguar, were more the masters here. Who were the real masters? In a few miles of this forest there must be more ants than there are men in the whole world. This seemed to Holroyd a perfectly new idea. In a few thousand years men had emerged from barbarism to a stage of civilization that had made them feel lords of the future and masters of the earth. But what was to prevent the ants evolving also? Such ants as one knew lived in little communities of a few thousand individuals, made no concerted efforts against the greater world. But they had a language. They had an intelligence. Why should things stop at that any more than men had stopped at the barbaric stage? Suppose presently the ants began to store knowledge, just as men had done by means of books and records, use weapons, form great empires, sustain a planned and organized war. Things came back to him that Gerolo had gathered about these ants they were approaching. They used a poison like the poison of snakes. They obeyed greater leaders, even as the cutting-leaf ants do. They were carnivorous, and where they came they stayed. The forest was very still. The water lapped incessantly against the side. About the lantern overhead there eddied a noiseless whirl of phantom moths. Gerolo stirred in the darkness and sighed. "Oh, what can one do?" he murmured, and turned over and was still again. Holroyd was roused from meditations that were becoming sinister by the hum of a mosquito. Part 2. The next morning Holroyd learned they were within 40 kilometers of Badama, and his interest in the banks intensified. He came up whenever an opportunity offered to examine his surroundings. He could see no signs of human occupation whatever, save for a weedy ruin of a house and the green-stained facade of the long-deserted monastery at Montjou, with a forest tree growing out of a vacant window space, and great creepers netted across its vacant portals. Several flights of strange yellow butterflies with semi-transparent wings crossed the river that morning, and many alighted on the Monitor and were killed by the men. It was towards afternoon that they came upon the derelict Cuberta. She did not at first appear to be derelict. Both her sails were set and hanging slack in the afternoon calm, and there was the figure of a man sitting on the foreplanking beside the shipped sweeps. Another man appeared to be sleeping face downwards on the sort of longitudinal bridge these big canoes have in the waist. But it was presently apparent, from the sway of her rudder and the way she drifted into the course of the gunboat, that something was out of order with her. Gerolo surveyed her through a field-glass, and became interested in the queer darkness of the face of the sitting man. A red-faced man, he seemed, without a nose. Crouching he was rather than sitting, and the longer the captain looked, the less he liked to look at him, and the less able he was to take his glasses away. But he did so at last, and went a little way to call up Holroyd. Then he went back to hail the Cuberta. He hailed her again,
and so she drove past him. Santa Rosa stood out clearly as her name. As she came by and into the wake of the Monitor, she pitched a little, and suddenly the figure of the crouching man collapsed as though all its joints had given way. His hat fell off, his head was not nice to look at, and his body flopped lax and rolled out of sight behind the bulwarks. "Caramba!" cried Garrelot, and resorted to Holroyd forthwith. Holroyd was halfway up the companion. "Did you see that?" said the captain. "Dead," said Holroyd. "Yes. You'd better send a boat aboard. There's something wrong." "Did you, by any chance, see his face?" "What was it like?" "It was... I have no words." And the captain suddenly turned his back on Holroyd and became an active and strident commander. The gunboat came about, steamed parallel to the erratic course of the canoe, and dropped the boat with Lieutenant Decuna and 3 sailors to board her. Then the curiosity of the captain made him draw up almost alongside as the lieutenant got aboard, so that the whole of the Santa Rosa, deck and hold, was visible to Holroyd. He saw now clearly that the sole crew of the vessel was these 2 dead men, and though he could not see their faces, he saw by their outstretched hands, which were all of ragged flesh, that they had been subjected to some strange, exceptional process of decay. For a moment his attention concentrated on those 2 enigmatical bundles of dirty clothes and laxly flung limbs, and then his eyes went forward to discover the open hold piled high with trunks and cases, and aft to where the little cabin gaped inexplicably empty. Then he became aware that the planks of the middle decking were dotted with moving black specks. His attention was riveted by these specks. They were all walking in directions radiating from the fallen man in a manner, the image came unsought to his mind, like the crowd dispersing from a bullfight. He became aware of Garrelot beside him. "Capo," he said, "have you your glasses? Can you focus as closely as those planks there?" Garrelot made an effort, grunted, and handed him the glasses. There followed a moment of scrutiny. "It's ants," said the Englishman, and handed the focused field glasses back to Garrelot. His impression of them was of a crowd of large black ants, very like ordinary ants except for their size, and for the fact that some of the larger of them bore a sort of clothing of gray. But at the time his inspection was too brief for particulars. The head of Lieutenant Decuna appeared over the side of the cuberta, and a brief colloquy ensued. "You must go aboard," said Garrelot. The lieutenant objected that the boat was full of ants. "You have your boots," said Garrelot. The lieutenant changed the subject. "How did these men die?" he asked. Captain Garrelot embarked upon speculations that Holroyd could not follow, and the 2 men disputed with a certain increasing vehemence. Holroyd took up the field glass and resumed his scrutiny, first of the ants, and then of the dead man amidships. He has described these ants to me very particularly. He says they were as large as any ants he has ever seen, black, and moving with a steady deliberation very different from the mechanical fussiness of the common ant. About 1 in 20 was much larger than its fellows, and with an exceptionally large head. These reminded him at once of the master workers who are said to rule over the leaf-cutter ants. Like them, they seemed to be directing and coordinating the general movements. They tilted their bodies back in a manner altogether singular, as if they made some use of the 4 feet. And he had a curious fancy that he was too far off to verify, that most of these ants of both kinds were wearing accoutrements, had things strapped about their bodies by bright white bands like white metal threads. He put down the glasses abruptly, realizing that the question of discipline between the captain and his subordinate had become acute. "It is your duty," said the captain, "to go aboard. It is my instructions." The lieutenant seemed on the verge of refusing.
The head of one of the mulatto sailors appeared beside him. "I believe these men were killed by the ants," said Holroyd abruptly in English. The captain burst into a rage. He made no answer to Holroyd. "I have commanded you to go aboard," he screamed to his subordinate in Portuguese. "If you do not go aboard forthwith, it is mutiny, rank mutiny, mutiny and cowardice. Where is the courage that should animate us? I will have you in irons. I will have you shot like a dog." He began a torrent of abuse and curses. He danced to and fro. He shook his fists. He behaved as if beside himself with rage, and the lieutenant, white and still, stood looking at him. The crew appeared forward with amazed faces. Suddenly, in a pause of this outbreak, the lieutenant came to some heroic decision, saluted, drew himself together, and clambered upon the deck of the cuberta. "Ah!" said Garileau, and his mouth shut like a trap. Holroyd saw the ants retreating before Dacuna's boots. The Portuguese walked slowly to the fallen man, stooped down, hesitated, clutched his coat, and turned him over. A black swarm of ants rushed out of the clothes, and Dacuna stepped back very quickly and trod 2 or 3 times on the deck. Holroyd put up the glasses. He saw the scattered ants about the invader's feet, and doing what he had never seen ants doing before. They had nothing of the blind movements of the common ant. They were looking at him, as a rallying crowd of men might look at some gigantic monster that had dispersed it. "How did he die?" the captain shouted. Holroyd understood the Portuguese to say the body was too much eaten to tell. "What is there forward?" asked Garileau. The lieutenant walked a few paces and began his answer in Portuguese. He stopped abruptly and beat off something from his leg. He made some peculiar steps as if he was trying to stamp on something invisible, and went quickly towards the side. Then he controlled himself, turned about, walked deliberately forward to the hold, clambered up to the foredecking from which the sweeps are worked, stooped for a time over the second man, groaned audibly, and made his way back and aft to the cabin, moving very rigidly. He turned and began a conversation with his captain, cold and respectful in tone on either side, contrasting vividly with the wrath and insult of a few moments before. Holroyd gathered only fragments of its purport. He reverted to the field-glass, and was surprised to find the ants had vanished from all the exposed surfaces of the deck. He turned towards the shadows beneath the decking, and it seemed to him they were full of watching eyes. The cuberta, it was agreed, was derelict, but too full of ants to put men aboard to sit and sleep. It must be towed. The lieutenant went forward to take in and adjust the cable, and the men in the boat stood up to be ready to help him. Holroyd's glasses searched the canoe. He became more and more impressed by the fact that a great, if minute and furtive activity was going on. He perceived that a number of gigantic ants, they seemed nearly a couple of inches in length, carrying oddly shaped burthens for which he could imagine no use, were moving in rushes from one point of obscurity to another. They did not move in columns across the exposed places, but in open, spaced-out lines oddly suggestive of the rushes of modern infantry advancing under fire. A number were taking cover under the dead man's clothes, and a perfect swarm was gathering along the side over which Dacuna must presently go. He did not see them actually rush for the lieutenant as he returned, but he has no doubt they did make a concerted rush. Suddenly the lieutenant was shouting and cursing and beating at his legs. "I am stung!" he shouted, with a face of hate and accusation towards Garileau. Then he vanished over the side, dropped into his boat, and plunged at once into the water. Holroyd heard the splash. The 3 men in the boat pulled him out and brought him aboard. And that night he died. Part 3. Holroyd and the captain came out of the cabin in which the swollen and contorted body of the lieutenant lay.
and stood together at the stern of the Monitor, staring at the sinister vessel they trailed behind them. It was a close, dark night that had only phantom flickerings of sheet lightning to illuminate it. The Cuberta, a vague black triangle, rocked about in the steamer's wake, her sails bobbing and flapping, and the black smoke from the funnels, spark-lit ever and again, streamed over her swaying masts. Garrelow's mind was inclined to run on the unkind things the lieutenant had said in the heat of his last fever.
"He says I murdered him," he protested. "It is simply absurd. Someone had to go aboard. Are we to run away from these confounded ants whenever they show up?"
Holroyd said nothing. He was thinking of a disciplined rush of little black shapes across bare, sunlit planking.
"It was his place to go," harped Garrelow. "He died in the execution of his duty. What has he to complain of? Murdered. But the poor fellow was, demented. He was not in his right mind. The poison swelled him.
They came to a long silence.
"We will sink that canoe. Burn it. And then?"
The inquiry irritated Garrelow. His shoulders went up. His hands flew out at right angles from his body.
"What is one to do?"
he said, his voice going up to an angry squeak.
"Anyhow," he broke out vindictively, "every ant in that Cuberta, I will burn them alive."
Holroyd was not moved to conversation. A distant ululation of howling monkeys filled the sultry night with foreboding sounds, and as the gunboat drew near the black, mysterious banks, this was reinforced by a depressing clamor of frogs.
"What is one to do?"
the captain repeated after a vast interval, and suddenly becoming active and savage and blasphemous, decided to burn the Santa Rosa without further delay. Everyone aboard was pleased by that idea. Everyone helped with zest. They pulled in the cable, cut it, and dropped the boat and fired her with tow and kerosene, and soon the Cuberta was crackling and flaring merrily amidst the immensities of the tropical night. Holroyd watched the mounting yellow flare against the blackness, and the livid flashes of sheet lightning that came and went above the forest summits, throwing them into momentary silhouette, and his stoker stood behind him, watching also. The stoker was stirred to the depths of his linguistics.
"Soba go pop pop," he said.
"Wah!" and laughed richly. But Holroyd was thinking that these little creatures on the decked canoe had also eyes and brains. The whole thing impressed him as incredibly foolish and wrong, but what was one to do? This question came back enormously reinforced on the morrow, when at last the gunboat reached Badama. This place, with its leaf-thatch-covered houses and sheds, its creeper-invaded sugar mill, its little jetty of timber and canes, was very still in the morning heat, and showed never a sign of living men. Whatever ants there were at that distance were too small to see.
"All the people have gone," said Garrelow. "But we will do one thing anyhow. We will hoot and whistle."
So Holroyd hooted and whistled. Then the captain fell into a doubling fit of the worst kind.
"There is one thing we can do," he said presently.
"What's that?" said Holroyd.
"Hoot and whistle again."
So they did. The captain walked his deck and gesticulated to himself. He seemed to have many things on his mind. Fragments of speeches came from his lips. He appeared to be addressing some imaginary public tribunal, either in Spanish or Portuguese. Holroyd's improving ear detected something about ammunition. He came out of these preoccupations suddenly into English.
"My dear Holroyd," he cried, and broke off with, "But what can one do?"
They took the boat and the field glasses and went close in to examine the place. They made out a number of big ants, whose still postures had a certain effect of watching them, dotted about the edge of the rude embarkation jetty. Garrelow tried ineffectual pistol shots at these. Holroyd thinks he distinguished curious earthworks running between the nearer houses, that may have been the work of the insect conquerors of those human habitations. The explorers pulled past the jetty and became aware of a human skeleton wearing a loincloth, and very bright and clean and shining, lying beyond. They came to a pause regarding this. "I have all those lives to consider," said Garrilo suddenly. Holroyd turned and stared at the captain, realizing slowly that he referred to the unappetizing mixture of races that constituted his crew. "To send a landing party, it is impossible. Impossible. They will be poisoned. They will swell up and abuse me and die. It is totally impossible. If we land, I must land alone. Alone, in thick boots, and with my life in my hand. Perhaps I should live, or again I might not land. I do not know. I do not know." Holroyd thought he did, but he said nothing. "The whole thing," said Garrilo suddenly, "has been got up to make me ridiculous. The whole thing." They paddled about and regarded the clean white skeleton from various points of view, and then they returned to the gunboat. Then Garrilo's indecisions became terrible. Steam was got up, and in the afternoon the Monitor went on up the river with an air of going to ask somebody something, and by sunset came back again and anchored. A thunderstorm gathered and broke furiously, and then the night became beautifully cool and quiet, and everyone slept on deck, except Garrilo, who tossed about and muttered. In the dawn he awakened Holroyd. "Lord," said Holroyd, "what now?" "I have decided," said the captain. "What? To land?" said Holroyd, sitting up brightly. "No," said the captain, and was for a time very reserved. "I have decided," he repeated, and Holroyd manifested symptoms of impatience. "Well, yes," said the captain. "I shall fire the big gun." And he did. Heaven knows what the ants thought of it, but he did. He fired it twice with great sternness and ceremony. All the crew had wadding in their ears, and there was an effect of going into action about the whole affair. And first they hit and wrecked the old sugar mill, and then they smashed the abandoned store behind the jetty. And then Garrilo experienced the inevitable reaction. "It is no good," he said to Holroyd. "No good at all. No sort of bally good. We must go back for instructions. There will be the devil of a row about this ammunition of... The devil of a row. You don't know, Holroyd." He stood regarding the world in infinite perplexity for a space. "But what else was there to do?" he cried. In the afternoon the Monitor started downstream again, and in the evening a landing party took the body of the lieutenant and buried it on the bank upon which the new ants have so far not appeared. Part 4. I heard this story in a fragmentary state from Holroyd not 3 weeks ago. These new ants have got into his brain, and he has come back to England with the idea, as he says, of exciting people about them before it is too late. He says they threaten British Guiana, which cannot be much over a trifle of 1,000 miles from their present sphere of activity, and that the Colonial Office ought to get to work upon them at once. He declaims with great passion. These are intelligent ants. Just think what that means. There can be no doubt that they are a serious pest, and that the Brazilian government is well advised in offering a prize of £500 for some effectual method of extirpation. It is certain, too, that since they first appeared in the hills beyond Ladama, about 3 years ago, they have achieved extraordinary conquests. The whole of the south bank of the Batimo River for nearly 60 miles they have in their effectual occupation. They have driven men out completely, occupied plantations and settlements, and boarded and captured at least one ship.
It is even said that they have, in some inexplicable way, bridged the very considerable Capurana arm and pushed many miles towards the Amazon itself. There can be little doubt that they are far more reasonable and with a far better social organization than any previously known ant species. Instead of being in dispersed societies, they are organized into what is in effect a single nation. But their peculiar and immediate formidableness lies not so much in this as in the intelligent use they make of poison against their larger enemies. It would seem this poison of theirs is closely akin to snake poison, and it is highly probable they actually manufacture it, and that the larger individuals among them carry the needle-like crystals of it in their attacks upon men. Of course, it is extremely difficult to get any detailed information about these new competitors for the sovereignty of the globe. No eyewitnesses of their activity, except for such glimpses as Holroyd's, have survived the encounter. The most extraordinary legends of their prowess and capacity are in circulation in the region of the upper Amazon, and grow daily as the steady advance of the invader stimulates men's imaginations through their fears. These strange little creatures are credited not only with the use of implements and a knowledge of fire and metals, and with organized feats of engineering that stagger our northern minds, unused as we are to such feats as that of the Saubus of Rio de Janeiro, who, in 1841, drove a tunnel under Parahyba, where it is as wide as the Thames at London Bridge, but with an organized and detailed method of record and communication analogous to our books. So far, their action has been a steady, progressive settlement, involving the flight or slaughter of every human being in the new areas they invade. They are increasing rapidly in numbers, and Holroyd, at least, is firmly convinced that they will finally dispossess man over the whole of tropical South America. And why should they stop at tropical South America? Well, they are there anyhow. By 1911, or thereabouts, if they go on as they are going, they ought to strike the Capurana Extension Railway and force themselves upon the attention of the European capitalist. By 1920, they will be halfway down the Amazon. I fix 1950 or 60 at the latest for the discovery of Europe.